Welcome, listeners and readers alike, to The Writing Affliction with authors Cat and Cats. I am Catherine Thornwood. You can find me at catherinethornwood.com. I am a blogger and a fantasy writer.
And I am R Cats. You can find me at my website, rcatsbooks.com, or on TikTok and Instagram at author rcats. And I write mostly contemporary romance and sports romance, but I'm starting to branch out a little bit into some historical and to some dark romance stories.
Our Cats, aka Ruby, is way better at social media than me, but we pretend and it's still fun. And honestly, we started this because we love talking books and we talk books and writing all the time with each other. And so we decided to do it again. So last episode, we talked all about fan fiction because for both Ruby and I, that is how we got our start in writing seriously and also how we became friends.
And it's a great training place. This is what we were talking about. If you didn't tune into the last podcast about how to actually learn how to write, how to craft the story. And it gives you a built-in support network of people who like your stories. You're going to make friends with it. And you're going to wind up with a group like Kat and I did that become your ride or die. We've been friends for 5 years and still going strong. We met because of fandom writing. And now we both transitioned into writing traditional novels. We still write fandom.
Yes, we do.
So that's not going to go away, but it's just like it helps to have somebody to geek out with, to plot with, or to be able to be like, I'm such a horrible writer. And they go, no, you're not. Okay, fine, I'm not. But I'm going to sit there and say I am because I'm having a bad day.
Yep. And fandom is a great place my favorite part about writing in fandom is actually that's where I experiment and I do stuff that I would not normally do in writing. Like, wonder what would happen if I tried writing second person present tense. That's going to be fun and a challenge. Because for me, like maybe I don't want to try to write a novel in that style, but it's a great place to sort of know that you're going to have people look at it. But today we actually wanted to talk about something that is way more serious than the noodling around of fan fiction, which is as people have all been watching, there have been a lot of stories coming out by people who started in fan fiction. In fact, I think that what's funny is right now, what was happening a lot behind the scenes is now kind of out in the open. You have very famous fan fictions now getting publishing deals like Alchemized. But fun facts you might not know, Cassandra Clare started in fan fiction. Holly Black started in fan fiction. Ali Hazelwood started in fan fiction. So there are a lot of fan fiction writers out there who are now very successful authors doing great stuff that maybe it's not, the implicit was not so explicit. So today, Ruby and I would like to talk about how one takes that big epic fan fiction that they wrote and they finished and they love, and how would they make that into an original story? So some of the things you're going to hear about are, for instance, when is it okay to keep things fanficky, i.e., when do you not need to remove those, when you do not need to file off those serial numbers? What makes fan fiction, or like just the fan fiction in general, different from original stories? And then let's say that all of those things you're looking at and you see that like juicy story you might have, what do you actually probably need to pay the most attention to when you're actually sitting down and saying, I am going to convert this fan fiction into an original story?
And that can be kind of a tricky thing to try and figure out because one of the things that we had discussed in the last podcast, but is definitely needing to be mentioned here, and the reason why we're talking about filing off the serial numbers is if you're writing fan fiction, that's somebody's copyrighted characters, unless you're talking something that's in the public domain, which I know we'll get into a little bit later. So if you're talking, you want to write a fan fiction of Jane Austen's characters, that's in the public domain, you're fine. But if you want to write a fan fiction about Harry Potter, that's all owned by J.K. Rowling, and she owns those copyrights. So you can't use those characters and just say, I'm just going to change the names and still have it completely recognizable that my main character has a lightning bolt scar across his forehead that he received when he was a child because of a wizard. You've made it very obvious at that point that it's from a fan fiction. So, what does filing off the serial number mean? And how do you decide when you need to make a modification and how do you modify it so it can become that original fiction?
Yeah. I think the first thing sort of to start off saying is that there are actually some things fundamentally about the way one writes a successful fan fiction and the way one writes a successful traditionally published book. There are also things about a successful fan fiction that are going to be exactly the same. So things like good prose, excellent dialogue, interesting stakes, cool plot. Many of those things are going to, are in the Venn diagram that overlaps for both fan fiction and for original fiction. But that's not everything. And in fact, some of the most successful things you're going to want to put into a fan fiction are things that probably won't work traditionally. So, one of my favorite examples of this is in many fandoms, including the one that Ruby and I met in. Some of the highest kudos count stories. Kudos being a reader goes in, reads it on Archive of Our Own, and clicks a button that explicitly says that they liked it. Are stories that have 400,000 word counts and above, things that are just epically long, things that in traditional publishing you would find as being part of a series rather than necessarily one single thing. The reason people come into a fandom is because, for instance, when they watched the original thing, they fell in love and they wanted to surround themselves in this blanket of those things that made them feel, sparkly, happy joy. They wanted to immerse themselves in that universe. And what that means is for the people coming and seeking out the stories and fan fiction of that, they can't get enough. They want to read everything they possibly can. They want to know how their two favorite characters wash dishes together. They want to know how they're going to declare love to each other. And they want them to declare love to each other over and over and over and over and over again, because that's why they're there. They're there to eat as many cakes as humanly possible when those cakes are decorated with the pictures of their favorite characters. So what that means is that because what they're going for is how much time can I spend thinking about living with in the world of this character that I love so much. And I guess I shouldn't say they, I should say we, these characters that I love so much. How can I do that for as long as possible? And so, again, that's actually part of why really epically long stories in fan fiction do so well, is because it gives the reader a chance to experience and live in the world of those characters for a lot longer.
Like I've read fan fictions that are at the 1.3 million word count, which you would never find that in a traditionally published unless you're talking something where it's a 5 to 6 part series. With the million pages, million words, you're probably at that point talking like a 10 part series. So you get a lot more of that story building and that story crafting because we love the characters. And sometimes you get into writing fan fiction or writing into a fandom because there's something that you want to see explored. It's not just seeing the characters fall in love over and over and over, although I will happily see my favorite characters fall in love and I will swoon over every story that I write. But I originally got into fan fiction because I wanted to see like and explore, okay, but how did their childhood create them into the characters that they're in today that we meet when we first enter into the fandom? How did they get to that point? And so I started my fan fiction journey writing one of the characters as a child just to explore that background. So it's the things where if you look at it and say, I want to explore this, I want to look at that. But if you're talking a traditionally published, people aren't really going to want to be reading a story of a 5-year-old that is facing hardship or facing trauma, where you could get that in fan fiction because people already know the characters and also want to see that backstory.
It's the difference between going on a first date and already being so completely in love and infatuated with the person that you're going on the date with that you never want the date to end.
Right.
So, that is one of the major things that makes things different. It means that what might be a really successful original story might not be quite as successful in fan fiction because of the fact that in original stories you have a distinct beginning, middle, and end. You have stakes, you have pacing, you have a story that you sort of want to make sure wraps up in a way that is satisfactory, especially for things like debut novelists who readers might not trust that person yet. So what would work as like every single day we're going to follow this character again, and most of the days are going to do the same thing, and most of the days it's just, you know, getting up, going to work, doing the dishes, going to their flower shop, and, you know, flirting with the, you know, their love interest. In the originals, you're looking more at how you're going to make somebody care enough and be interested enough in those characters in the first place to keep reading.
It's also one of the things that I've found too, going between original fan fiction or original stories and fan fiction. This is kind of what you were talking about a little bit before, Kat, is the difference in the stakes. And maybe it's just the fandom that we wrote in, but any story that you have, unless it's something that's a small or just pure fluff story, there is some major external conflict. It's not just that you have an internal conflict or internal strife between the characters. There's some external big bad. There's some external force that is influencing the characters and influencing the story that when I read a lot of original stories, I don't that's not something that's typically seen unless you're in the romantasy genre.
That is definitely true for romantasy. And believe me, we are going to have an entire episode on fantasy romance versus romantasy versus romantic fantasy in the future.
And yes,
Um,
they're very different. All three of them, they sound the same. They're not. They're definitely not.
so so again, like let's say you've looked at your story and you know, I this definitely happened to both Ruby and me. We fell in love almost with the character archetype as much as we fell in love with the character themselves. That we wanted to take that character and see what happened in scenarios so completely different from what the original story was that we were writing in what's called alternative universes, almost more than we were writing in what's called the canon universe, i.e., the universe in which the story actually exists. So taking an example, we're going to go back to Jane Austen. So, as we said earlier, Jane Austen is in the public domain. Yay! Public domain is really awesome. That means that you can write Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Bennet and Wickham without thinking about whether or not you have to change names because Jane Austen's estate it is not going to come after you and cannot come after you financially for writing for that. But if I were writing a story in canon, what that means is I was writing a story in Regency, England, taking place at Netherfield Park in Meryton. Maybe you can go a little canon divergent and instead you make it so that Darcy's the one who's renting Netherfield Park instead of Bingley. An alternative universe is where you take the character of Darcy and the character of Elizabeth and you transpose them into something else. Maybe you make Darcy a big CEO of some company and you make Elizabeth the sassy waitress who works at the coffee shop in the lobby of his building, and you take the character personalities and you can make an entirely different plot based on the characters, based on their names, and you put them there. Um, it's kind of
Thank you for
interesting.
giving me a new idea, by the way. Dang it.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry. Um, so what that means is that what's interesting is in fandom and in fan fiction, often the most popular stories are the ones that are sticking the closest to canon. That's not always true, but overall, the people who are coming in, who are falling in love, who are in love and want to be in love over and over and over and over again, are wanting to immerse themselves in the original world that those characters are in. So what that means is that oftentimes the most quote unquote successful you're going to be is a fan fiction author. And again, this is so many 857 caveats to this particular statement because there is definitely a zeitgeist and definitely randomness to this, is writing a canon compliant story with the two characters that people love falling in love that is really, really long, where they just have interesting and fun adventures day after day after day after day. Which again is not the story. Like it's the story of Elizabeth Bennet's life after she has her children with Mr. Darcy, and they're just living in Pemberley, and they're happy and healthy. And oftentimes, yes, fandom does earn its reputation for having a lot of not safe for work rated things. So you add that in, you're probably going to even up your popularity more. That is not necessarily what you're going to be doing. And the fan fictions that are ideal for taking and turning traditional is probably not that story. It's the story about Darcy being a CEO and Elizabeth Bennet being a sassy barista, because of the fact that that story becomes a little bit easier to differentiate between from the originals. If you are going with not something in the public domain, like I've been going with, if you're going with Marvel. If you're going with Marvel characters that are not in the public domain, you're really going to need to be in an alternative universe, very likely.
And that's where it's can be a little bit difficult to know that balance and to know what needs to change and how you need to change it. And I'll be flat out honest. One of the stories that I have published, I did adapt from a fan fiction, but it's based off of Sense and Sensibility, because there's a very by Jane Austen, because there's a very big thing that I wanted to see changed in the original story, and so I did. But because it's in that public domain, I can get away with that because of the fact that the story was published in the 1800s. Nobody holds a copyright to it, so it's fair use. But if I was trying to create something based off of the big fandom that you see a lot of fan fiction coming out of right now is Hermione, Draco and Hermione from the Harry Potter series. Those are very identifiable and recognizable characters. And so when you're adapting a fan fiction from that series, you do need to make some changes. One of the things that Kat and I have both found when we were adapting fan fiction, when you're in the fan fiction and you're in the fandom world, there's a very set universe. Yes, you may change the setting, you may change where the characters are and what their story is, but everybody knows the characters, everybody knows the magic, everybody knows the lore, everybody knows about what this type of character. Is it a fandom that is elves? Is it a fandom that's demons? People already know it, so you don't have to spend a lot of time building that world. But when you transition it into an original story, now you're suddenly having to add to it because you have to create the entire world and make it make sense. And that can be one of the biggest challenges, as Kat is very aware,
Oh my
um,
gosh, yes.
when you're trying to transition and make that into an original story for publication. Because now it's no longer, I have this hot elf that everybody knows in this fandom, and so I don't have to spend a lot of time into it. And then all of a sudden it's, wait, yeah, no, I have to go back and justify all of these things. So let me go back and add this and let me put this in and oh, okay, let me change this. And yeah, we're just having to do a complete rewrite now. It's fine.
Yeah, that was so as Ruby's been alluding to, I just adapted a pretty really 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 alternative universe story from our fandom into an original. And it's a like it's not Lord of the Rings, but I'll use Lord of the Rings as an example. First off, Tolkien lived a very long time, which was a treasure for, all humans, but it also means that Lord of the Rings is very much not in the public domain. But it's taking, you have a story where you have Legolas falling in love with somebody. What are you going to do? Suddenly, elves don't quite work because you have based them completely on Middle Earth. And like, let's face it, Tolkien did his work in building that world, which means that if you say Legolas, everybody gets that idea and that framework of who Legolas was, what the elves were like, where they were coming from. If they've read the Silmarillion, they even know the origin of the elves, etc. And saying, well, okay, this is still going to be a long blonde haired elf. Oh no, maybe I'm not going to use elf. Maybe I'll use fairy. Well, where did the fairies get the powers that they got? Where did that come from? What kind of origin story is that coming from? So suddenly, as you're sort of working on the world, I'd actually say that world building is probably the hardest thing. Um, you're you're asking 1,000 questions you didn't need to ask before.
Hashtag facts.
Ugh.
There is a reason
So
why I do not touch romantasy, and that is because I've never actually I used to play D&D, and I played a lot of D&D with my husband and our friends. I've never did a DM game, but everybody keeps telling me that that's how you really build as a romantasy is you create it like you're preparing for a D&D campaign, but even there you have a defined magic system. You have a defined world that people know the characters and they know how they react. This is very different where you're sitting there essentially having to create what is the religion? What is the world like? What is the hierarchy? How does the magic work? Are there religious figures? How do the religious figures come in? What are the lore? What is this? What are the that? And I'm like, I'm just gonna go hide in my contemporary romance land and you can deal with that cat. I'm fine.
it's so much fun.
It is
Um,
not fun.
it's well, I have a background in physics and astrophysics, so I have particular amounts of fun solving the problems of like, how can I make a magic world? How can I make magic in this world work? What can I do? And again, the way that I solved my problem was I took characters and I turned them into infernal, Dante Alighieri style demons. And then I went, okay, I need to give them some magic, but not much magic. Well, what if it's a case that, the infernal plane is literally hell and no one wants to live in hell? So the demons were like, wait, I can go to a place that's like not hell and live. That's awesome. I'm going to do that. And suddenly you can start, you start to watch as this world snowballs and snowballs and snowballs as you ask more questions and, approach it like you're solving problems. Um, it meant that, the rewrite of that particular story took a really long time because I realized that I had so much that I needed to explain that the first time I didn't have to. Because again, the original creator was the one who answered those questions for me. Where did this particular, style of magic come from? Oh, it came from this particular lore. And everybody who is reading your story inside of the fandom knows that lore. So, um, it yes, it also means that like taking the characters and seeing what happens if you plop them into a contemporary urban setting, you sort of like that's great and that's awesome and that makes things a little bit easier because you're putting them in a world that also has defined rules that most people understand. And that's great. So it probably means that it could mean that Ruby and I have different areas that we find the hardest part of when we were adapting fan fiction. In my case, it was definitely trying to take and make a cogent, believable, understandable world that includes a magic system and a society system and a religious system and these different beings. And for
And I just
Ruby, it
hide from
actually
that. I just hide from that. I don't go there.
oh,
I'm
don't
not doing
worry.
it.
There are other problems that you have that I have too that is very painful, which is um there are also things exactly like the questions you ask about the world that are getting asked about the characters that you don't think
Yes.
about.
Yeah, you will not realize just how much people will care about the style of dress because the style of dress will change their personality. So when I'm going through and I'm plotting out characters, like I started um my I guess now I would sit there and say that it was supposed to be my fifth novel, but I guess now it's my sixth because I have two others that I'm actively working on, and yeah, I have a problem. But the first thing I did was I sat down and started going, okay, let me think about the characters. And it wasn't just let me think about the character's name and personality. It was what is the character's name? What is their personality? Who are their best friends? Who are their family? What is their style? What are their hobbies? What how do they relax? What do they do for fun? Who are the people that they've met? What like what schools did they go to? What is their background? And I probably have about a 5,000 word document just outlining four characters because you need that level because one of the best things I always found was and this is like when I went back and rewrote my Sense and Sensibility adaptation, there were things where I'm like, okay, if I have them do this in the original, everybody knows it because it's this character, so everybody knows what their motivation is. But now I need to know what were they thinking before they entered the room? How is that influencing how they've entered the room? Is this now Colonel Brandon is coming in and he's hopeful? Is he coming in resigned because he thinks he's lost the woman that he loves, Marianne, to Lord Willoughby? Is he coming in where he's like almost mournful? Is he coming in where he's bright-eyed and thinking I'm going to steal her? Because it changes the entire dynamic of the chapter if you know what they're doing just before they enter.
Yeah. And the without the original, if you're filing off serial numbers without the original characterization, you don't necessarily know why the character is doing that thing. They're maybe interacting completely different, and you have to sit down and think like, okay, well, if I still want my male love interest to be a little bit bratty and broody, what makes that character bratty and broody? Is it because, if it's no longer because, they're they're an elf who gave up their immortality. What is it now? Like that they're in the real world? What has created that personality? And so this is actually something that I'd say fan fiction writers do exceptionally well is actually character consistency. So again, like because of the fact that you're playing in like you're writing in somebody else's intellectual property and you are writing to an audience who are very, very familiar with the characters, you're sitting down and you're taking those characters and needing to write them in a way that people are convinced that they are the same characters that they know and love. The thing that again we stumble over going into original writing is actually the character, the origins of the character. So creating that new backstory, just like creating that new world. You have to think through each of those things. You have to think through why your character is reacting that way. And sometimes your character is not the filing off of the serial numbers is going to make your character do things that are different than you had originally had in the fan fiction. I definitely had a case where I had a character who needed to run away for a month and hide in the original story that did not happen in the fan fiction because I realized that that's what that character would do.
And it just really comes down to, and that's one of the things that I think I have struggled with creating the original characters. I keep falling back into, especially with my main male characters, you get comfortable writing a certain style of a guy. And so almost every single book you've read of mine is probably going to have the main male character in some ways hasn't always fit in and is looking for somebody to finally accept him and will then come out of his shell for the woman who acknowledges and accepts him and sees him because that's what I'm used to, but it's also that's kind of like what I was when I was a kid. So you write what you know, but sometimes you're writing the character that is very, very confident, and you didn't think that was the way this character was going to go. But when you're saying, okay, let me take it out of the fan fiction, let me take it out of this character, what is the right motivation for this character? You may find their entire personality has changed because you're creating a new world for them, new backgrounds, new experiences, new things that have shaped who they are and how they got there. And I always joke because my background's in theater. And one of the things I actually rebelled about when I was in high school and we were in our performing arts class is they wanted us to create entire backstories of our character, even if they only had 2 lines. They wanted entire, like 10-page backstories of everybody. And I kept looking at them going, why? Well, now that I'm a writer, I'm like, oh, that makes entire sense. Because if I'm walking
That's
in and
why.
and my line is just, how dare you? If I'm walking in and it's like, it's something where he's like, is so used to the world being absolutely perfect and nothing ever changes and suddenly somebody deviates one thing, I may be going and be like, how dare you? But if you're going in and it's somebody that is used to the world like disappointing them and they just take it as that's what's to be expected, you're looking at them going, how dare you? And it
I didn't
changes entirely the motivation of the character and how they approach every scene, which then changes how they interact with the other characters. And suddenly you're like, well, we have a whole new story here. Let's go.
I did not realize how much the college classes I took on psychology were going to benefit me as I wrote.
Yeah, there's so many classes that I took and so many things that when I was a kid, I was like, why are you asking me to do this? This is just so tedious. And now I'm like, I get it now. I
Yeah.
completely get it. I owe my teachers an apology.
A brash narcissist is going to react completely different than a self-hating introvert, in
Yep.
certain circumstances, and thinking those things through, as you're putting these characters together and putting them in, situations, changes things. And as I said, like I love how much sort of development I have had from fandom in character consistency. Once I know who that character is, I know how they're going to react in pretty much, in the scenarios that they go through in the plot, because I see them and I understand them. And again, I think part of that is just, if you're writing good fan fiction, you're writing characters that people recognize.
And that's why we do think, and we were talking yesterday, that fan fiction is such a great training ground for people who want to go into original stories because you learn a lot of the basics. And it's also a lot of people think that fan fiction is mostly authors who can't cut it or authors who aren't able to publish. That's not it. We have some people who, like, I would sit there and be like, if you publish this book and you put it out in the world, trust me, you'd become a bestseller. And I keep telling Kat, I think her stories are one of those. So I keep waiting for her stories to come out because she's going to take over the world. Um, but it's not people who don't have the skill. It's not people who don't have the talent. Some of the best writers I have seen came out of fan fiction. And we see that right now with original stories and a lot of publishing. Like Kat mentioned some of the names before. It's like the one that really comes to mind for me is that's been all the news is Allie Hazelwood. She started as a fan fiction writer. And now her stories are being adapted into major films.
She's a great voice. I'll just say, like, in her writing, it is so fun reading it. Like, you can, in her main characters, you can just feel who that main character actually is. And again, it's almost like a case where publishing has caught up to the fact that um fan fiction is not just 50 Shades of Grey, just to dunk on E.L. James, which, sorry, not sorry.
It's not all 50 Shades of Grey, and there's so much nuance that goes into it. Like I said, some of the best stories that I've written, and they're not all the stories are like 1.5 million because those are the anomaly. But they're some of the best stories that I keep going back to and reading over and over and over and over. They're not traditionally or original published books. They're fan fiction because the worlds are like the worlds and the characters are so well created and well defined that there is a reason why a lot of people who are fan fiction authors, now that it's no longer taboo to have made the transition, are starting to branch out into traditional and original publishing.
Basically, what Ruby and I are saying is you should read fan fiction. There are some absolute masterpieces out there, in that you never know about. There are masterpieces in fandoms that have like 500 total stories ever written. There are masterpieces in fandoms that have a million stories written. It varies so very much. So I guess some of the things that I guess the last piece that I really found, that I needed to work on, despite the fact that I was very careful what stories of mine I have selected to try to transition, is that even if you're writing an alternative universe, even if you're working with a really unique plot that is not, again, this canon consistent, I'd call it noodling style story, is that the plot often needs a lot of development as well. Um, this is fan fiction, is fan fiction has is a place where oftentimes people are exploring different pieces of the character and thinking about how the characters are going to react. And so there are often times that you as the writer are not sitting down and thinking to yourself, I'm going to take a story and I'm going to do a beginning, a middle, and end. I'm going to make sure that there is action, there are stakes. I'm making sure that I have put the pieces in place to so that you care about the characters. People who are doing fan fiction are often not following save the cat or the hero's journey. They're often saying, what do I want? What is it that I find missing about what I'm reading that I want to see? Well, guess what? I guess I'm going to have to be the person to write it. And so as you're actually looking through your own fan fiction to figure out what could become original, one of the things you really do want to pay attention to is, what does your plot look like? Um, I don't think that every story needs to be a save the cat story. I don't think every story needs to be a hero's journey story. But the reason that Save the Cat and Hero's Journey are mentioned over and over and over again is because they provide really good arcs
Sure.
that keep readers engaged and keep readers excited. And so you need to make sure that the elements that are making the Save the Cat, etc. style stories work are elements that you have in your fan fiction. So that's that canon compliant story that is right after, the end and the credits ran and it's their wedding day and their wedding night, because again, not safe for work, it is fanfic. Might not be the one that you want to adapt. It's going to be that kooky off the wall idea that came to you, at 3 o'clock in the morning, that you went into your Discord and you told your friends about, and your friends were like, that's unhinged. That's probably actually going to be the story that you're going to want to adapt, because you need to make sure that you have those elements that keep a reader engaged outside of people that have already bought in. It's like
Unless you're
making
me, and
sure.
then I don't pay attention to all of that stuff. I just kind of write, and then Kat's the one going, "All right, Ruby, what are you doing? Why are you doing this?" I'm like, "I'm just having fun." And she's like, "Ruby, Ruby, Ruby, Ruby." Yes, mom.
We both nah, you are also always you're looking for stakes, because not looking for stakes makes it a little bit harder in some stories for a writer to actually really get engaged in the story. I mean, maybe that's just me, that I'm a plotter, meaning that I have to have a full outline of a story before I can sit down and actually write it. But you're looking for the stakes, you're looking for why you care, because as the writer, you really want to care about these characters, and you want to do stuff to them that is interesting and engaging and keeps your, finger on your keyboard.
But also makes sense. And I think that's one of the big things that I've seen with people who are transitioning fan fiction into original stories is a motivation or something may work for the characters in your original fandom, but it may not make sense to somebody who doesn't have that background, who doesn't have that story, who doesn't have that lore behind them. And so that's one of the things that I know Kat and I have both looked into, was when we were doing the adaptation, is how does this now change the motivation? How does this change the story? And how much of a rewrite are we going to be talking here?
Yeah, sometimes it's a lot. Actually, I think probably often, if you're doing it well, it's a lot. Do not fall into the misinformation that all you have to do is change name and hair color. That is not enough.
It's not enough, especially with like what we've been talking about here, is if you've just changed the name and the hair color, but you still keep that lightning shaped scar in their forehead that they got when they were a child when somebody killed their parents, everybody's going to know who you're copying.
Yeah, and let's just say right here on the podcast, I know that I have basically boycotted that particular author because trans rights are human rights. Just,
Yes.
mic drop there.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's say that you have decided you're going to commit and you're going to do it. You know that it's going to be work. You're not just going to change a name and a hair color. You think you have a good magic system that you're going to base your new story on. You think you have backstories that you can write for those characters to pull them completely out of their fandom, and your plot is really fun and engaging. And as Ruby and I have said, we have read plenty of fan fictions that have plots that we would read instantaneously and just like read and reread and reread in
They would
fan
become
fiction.
instant. They become instant subscribe, and I'll be like, every single thing that they published, I will just devour.
Exactly. So let's say you have all of that. Now, we've already told you the world's going to take a lot of time to rebuild. You're going to be asking a lot of questions. The characters, you're going to be asking a lot of questions. The plot, you're going to want to look at and ask again. Follow, look at writing YouTubes, etc., and tutorials to make sure that the plot that you have created is one where you can answer the important questions of, why would a reader care? Why would a reader keep reading? So we're going to talk about a couple of the bad fanfic habits that are often seen. And I say this in the passive voice, despite the fact that, yes, I was a culprit of basically every single one of the things that I am going to be talking about here in this. So fan fiction, as we've said, oftentimes is about following characters who your audience has already fallen in love with. It means that you are probably going to be writing a ton of what I'd call superfluous fluff scenes because people want to see them declare their love for each other. People want to see them hold their hands for the first time. People want to see them kiss, and people want to see them kiss and more than kiss over and over and over again. And so you have probably actually inflated the word count you need in your story by a lot just by having a ton of these scenes. In traditional publishing or in original writing, you're maybe not going to have that many places where they need to be holding hands. And so I think the thing that I started looking at as I was reading was going like, oh, I don't need this scene here. And it feels like throwing out your children. I get that. You love these
It does.
characters. You're writing the story because you fell in love with them. And you can kind of still see the like little scratch of fan fiction on them. But that's probably the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to find all the places where you have superfluous fluff and get rid of it.
And that is very hard. And this is as somebody who went and took a brutal scalpel to my most recent book that I published. And I actually wound up cutting. This doesn't hurt to say because it just tells you like how much I like my extra stuff. I cut 20,000 words from the final version
Oh, I
before it ever
didn't.
got to my editor.
Ooh.
Because like I had scenes that were basically like the guy like they were walking around Philadelphia holding hands and just learning each other. I had him watching her for an entire chapter, just trying to figure out what was going on in her head. And I realized that as a fan fiction writer, that was something that I thought was interesting. But I started looking at it and reread it as if I was picking up that novel and reading it on my own and went, I don't need this because it's like I have the other elements. Just in fan fiction, we have the tendency to we need to add more, add more. We need to add more. I mean, I have a story that is out there in the fandom. It was originally supposed to be 10 chapters. I say this as I published 41 chapters and I'm only 2/3 of the way through with it. It was only supposed to be
Word
10
count
chapters.
inflation.
Word
We
count
love our
inflation.
word.
Yeah. It's
Yeah, we
over
love our word count.
130. It's over 130,000 words right now, and I'm only 2/3 of the way through with it. And that terrifies me.
And people love those stories. Like again, in fan fiction, people love the stories that are really, really long because it means that they get to stay with their favorite characters for longer. Same. One thing, yeah, like do I need them to declare their love for each other 6 times anymore?
Yes.
No. It does mean that I take all of those scenes, I fold them up like origami, and I stick them in a drawer so that, for instance, if I find that I need that scene again, I have it for myself to like put back into the story. Or if I want to write like a little fluffy aside to put on my blog because I just can't let that particular scene go, I have them available for me. Um, but it's definitely one of the things that as you're looking it's a habit, a fan fiction habit you have to break in traditional publishing is as you write your story, you can also write those scenes as you write the story because they're scenes that again keep you engaged and keep you in love. But when you're taking the next step and doing the editing, you're probably going to be, cutting a lot of those scenes out and again storing them in a drawer. I think I store them in my Scrivener file called scraps.
But it's also when you look at the average word count of of an original novel, and you look at the word count of fan fiction. Like I said, I have that story out there that's over 130,000 words. I'm 2/3 of the way through. The only way I'd be able to move that and put it into a traditional publishing is if I either put it into a two-part duology or I cut the hell out of it. Because a fantasy and sci-fi novel, the average word is between 100,000 and 115,000 for the entire novel. If you're talking a traditional romance or contemporary romance, it's 80,000 to 100,000. So that is a lot shorter than some of the numbers that we've been talking about with fan fiction. Like we both have stories out there that are easily over 100,000 words. And that's just because we fell in love with the characters and we're building the whole world. Like in one of my stories, I have an entire chapter where my character is having a mental breakdown. If that goes into a traditional publishing, I don't know if I would keep that in that chapter in, even though it works for the character, because I would have to go back and analyze and say, does this still work? Or does it work because it's in the fandom, but it's superfluous if it goes into a published novel?
Yeah, just to give some idea, and we'll post the link down down in the comments. When you're looking at stories that have over 200,000 words, you're looking at things like Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin, East of Eden by John Steinbeck, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. It's getting word counts that are that big, especially sort of right at the beginning as a debut author. Number one, if you're that costs more money to print.
Yeah.
It costs money for every, extra page you're adding above and beyond, whatever they consider the industry standard. Now, that being said, that's the beauty of self-publishing, actually, is that you can also understand if you need to have a big word count, that you can write a big word count. But again, some of it is understanding whether or not your big word count is because, for instance, you need to world build, you need to character, you need to build the relationships, you need all of that stuff to make sense, and you need to have the words required to actually do that. Or if it's because you're keeping scenes in that, again, a fandom is going to love, but a casual reader maybe won't.
Yeah, and that's always where, and as a writer, like I will sit there and say that when I cut those 20,000 words, oh, that hurt. That definitely hurt. Um, because I was trying to, I thought the story was great and I love it because as I'm very wordy and like in full disclosure, I'm an attorney. I spend most of my days writing. So I'm very used to having to be persuasive. And there's a school of thought in a lot of law that why say it in one word if you can use 10 pages?
The
uh,
lawyer and the astrophysicist, the exact opposite ends of the spectrum. For us, it's short is good.
yeah. But it's like when we're talking, what Kat was saying, like with the publishing, and one thing that a lot of people will use when they're publishing the book, and this is where you have to be careful about the length, because we'll get into this a little bit, maybe into another thing, especially if you're looking to go into the publishing. When you're talking trim sizes or the size of your book, are you talking a 5 by 8? Are you talking a 6 by 9? Are you talking a 5 1/4 by 8? Are you talking a 5 1/2 by 8 1/2? Are you talking a 4 by 7? And that all will change how many pages your book is. Like my most recent book that I have out is 246 pages. It's just under 70,000 words. And it cost me $4 to print each book. If I had that at 400 pages, even at the 5 by 8 that I printed at, which is a smaller size book, it would cost $7 per book to print. So
Yeah.
that means that if you're selling that book and if you're having it sold to bookstores at a 400-page novel, you're having to raise the price so that way you're actually making some income. And that's all part of the things that you'll be looking at. And that's why the word counts matter. You're not going to be publishing the $1.4 million story as one book because you would have to price the paper book back at $40 to be able to make any money off of it.
Yeah, most people are not going to be writing sort of the epics that you see, for instance, like authors like Brandon Sanderson write. Brandon Sanderson has a giant world that people love living in with him. And so his tendency to be fairly wordy is actually not like it's something that he can overcome just by being him and by having a fully engaged audience. So again, sometimes you're gonna have to kill your darlings, and that's just gonna be something to put your darling in a sidecar. Just don't have your darling as part of the train that's getting pulled. So, a couple of the other things that I know I have a habit that I'm trying really hard to break, is what I like to call Mary Suing. And Ruby and I have not talked about Mary Sue's, given that the actual term was coined based on a Star Trek fan fiction, in which basically a character named Mary Sue could do no wrong. And the thing about Mary Sue's is they're so perfect and everything goes their way that they're uninteresting. So, it does not mean a badass female character. That's not a Mary Sue. A Mary Sue is very specifically a cookie cutter perfect character who never has experienced conflict. But In fan fiction, again, because of the fact that you're walking into this place and you're asking audiences who are in love with the characters to read the words that you put, you're maybe going to have a little bit of a hard time giving those characters realistic human flaws that makes an original story interesting. So, gosh, there's a rival female love interest in one of the fandoms that Ruby and I are in. That boy howdy, that character gets hate, and that's because that character is flawed and not completely, not human. Um, and trying to, take, for instance, the main character and give that character flaws like that, you're going to actually get backlash from your fandom. So it means
Oh,
that
will
the
you?
right?
Oh, will you?
So that means that when you're writing these characters in fan fiction, you're often thinking about the fact that, oh, if I make this person struggle, if I make this person fight, if I make this person cheat, I am creating a situation where people who have built up and idolized this character are going to come after me. And the issue with that is that means that when you're transitioning it into an original work where you actually kind of want your characters to not be a Mary Sue and not be conflict free, sometimes you're going to pull those habits and pull those like mean comments with you. So you have to be really careful thinking to yourself, like, have I given this character enough depth um compared to like what I might have done in a fan fiction? And I know in the book that I was writing, I realized that I had made one of the characters, like, I knew how much grief I would get if that character was not perfect in the fandom. And I went, she's impulsive, and I need to make sure that in my book she's impulsive, and she can't do everything right and still be impulsive. She's going to have to make at least one stupid decision in her impulsivity. And made sure that those were pieces of the character, because those are things that real people do. Those are things that make your story interesting. And so that is actually something that can be very hard to let go of, is having flaws in the character, and having characters screw up is part of what makes books interesting. Sometimes people are gonna fuck up.
Yeah. But it's also what makes the characters compelling, because it's not how we deal with the situation when everything's going perfectly. It's how do we adapt and change when things go to hell? And that's one of the things that I always look for in stories. And sometimes if I'm reading a novel, and I read a lot, but there's times where I'm left at the end of the story and I'm like, okay, but the characters didn't change. There was nothing done. The only change is now, instead of we glare at each other when we pass each other in a corner, we kiss each other when we pass each other in a corner. That's literally the only change. And I'm like, it, because of my background in fan fiction, that almost seems hollow now, because there isn't that overcoming that flaw. There isn't that overcoming that adversity.
You definitely, and you definitely want the struggle, and you definitely want the growth. That's a lot more fun to read, is when, knowing why they're not glaring at each other in the hall anymore, why they're kissing each other in the hall, is really fun. I think one of, like, a major trope that we've seen a lot, but I'm just gonna say is one of my favorite tropes, is enemies to lovers. Writing that well is hard,
Yes.
because of the fact that if they hate each other, they probably had a pretty good reason to hate each other. And you can't just be like, well, I hate you, but you're really hot. That's really shallow. So you have to think about like what actually made them hate each other and what made them, fall in love. And again, that comes down to characterizations, but in particular, making sure you're not trying to make your characters perfect.
And part of that is,
Miscommunications are really fun, and like, oh, it turns out that like the reason that they hate each other has like a pretty good grounding, but they're actually both decent people. Like, you can do that. You just have to make sure you know what that conflict is and why they were, and like what it was about their characters that made them enemies in the first place.
yeah, I just played with a enemies to lovers in my most recent one, but it's not even so much, I guess, really enemies to lovers. It's more, I'm going to call it rivals to lovers. because they don't really hate each other. He just resents the fact of what she represents and why she's there. But it
Yep.
gives them that dynamic because you have that initial tension. You have that they're bickering back and forth. You don't really, depending on which fandom you're writing in, you don't always see that because you will get hate mail if you do anything that deviates from their carefully designed concept of characters. Like I talked about in one of my fan fictions, I gave a character a mental breakdown. Oh, the hate I got for that mental breakdown because
Yep.
she wasn't perfect. I'm like, but she's a real person then.
Yeah. So it it actually makes original writing more freeing. Because you don't have to, and I'll say this, I have written plenty of stories where my character was not perfect, and I just sort of like took the lumps that came with that in fan fiction. But it's a lot more fun not to actually have to do that. So I think that I'd say that the final thing in terms of bad fan fiction habits, I like to call it the eggplant in the room, i.e., fan fiction is definitely a place that kind of deserves its reputation for being where you can go and write your not safe for work stories about the characters that you love. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but I think that that's actually a great thing. The first, every time we have created a new kind of media, the very first thing people do with it is record each other having sex. That just is how human beings work. So the fact that you watch a movie, you love the movie, you love the chemistry between two people, and the movie because of the just
Ratings.
conventions and ratings, etc., you don't get to see those two characters do the thing that, as I said, what do you think the first thing the printing press printed was? You're going to want to go and you're going to want to read about it and explore it. And fandom was a place that not only could you explore your sexuality in a place that was safe and with characters that you were in love with, um, it was fundamentally a queer space. And that made it really special. Like some of the first the word slash, which is basically using a hash between two male characters, came from people writing magazines about Kirk and
And
Spock from Star Trek falling in love. Like it's
yep.
called Spirk, and they were putting out zines and doing this thing, and slash fic, which again is two men falling in love and doing the dirty, came out of that tradition. So it means that fan fiction not only is a really wonderful queer space, it's a really wonderful sexy space. But obviously, when you're looking at original writing, um, the unless you're writing erotica, and I think in this case, we're just going to presume you're not. Erotica has different rules, and Ruby and I are not the people you would want to be listening to figure out how to convert your fan fiction into erotica, because neither of us are erotica writers. Is looking at the exploration of sexuality that happens in fan fiction and understanding that probably the amount that you have in fan fiction would be considered gratuitous to a story. It kind of comes down to the same, superfluous fluff. It's just superfluous fluff that is no longer fluff. It's now smut. You actually need to ask yourself, do you need that sex scene?
Yes, you do. But I also say this as somebody who just finished writing a 3-chapter sex scene. So you can get away with that in fan fiction. That's not always the
Yes.
best in traditional publishing because a lot of unless you are writing in the erotica genre, a lot of fan fiction, okay, let's be honest, it's not smut, it's cliterature. Let's call it the right thing. A lot of cliterature scenes in fan fiction are a lot more detailed than you will see in original publishing. And that's partially because, like, that's why 50 Shades of Grey really, I think, blew up so much because it took the explicitness of fan fiction and now suddenly it was published for everybody to buy on Amazon. And everybody went, wait, what's this? Yes, we're going to get into a BDSM story. Sure.
Oh, don't get me started on whether or not it was actually,
I'm
but yeah.
I am making no
Yep.
statements as to whether or not it's a good depiction because I had people who had opinions when it got published. So we're just not going
Yeah.
there.
Let's just say the answer of is it a good depiction is no.
But it was a lot of people's real introduction into it who were not always exposed to that lifestyle. Now, that is something that is played with quite often in fan fiction. You will see elements of BDSM. You will see entire stories dedicated to characters being part of a BDSM lifestyle or having a role play night. But you don't really see that in original fiction because of it's considered a taboo subject, or it puts you into the erotica genre.
Well, and just two men having a relationship with each other, or two women having a relationship with each other, even if it is the most vanilla sex you've ever seen, is often, is taboo enough that, like, look at book banners, like, look at what they're trying to ban. They're trying to ban, like, two penguins being dads.
Yep.
So fan fiction was kind of that safe respite for people to explore those pieces of themselves that traditional society wasn't letting them explore. That being said, I actually have rules of thumb that I tend to follow for sex scenes because I'm not, I'm a fan fiction author who has definitely written her share of not safe for work scenes. Is that I like to make sure that if the scene is in the book, could is it a scene that I could fade to black and the scene still should be there? I.e., is it something that changes the way the characters bring changes the relationship between the characters, does something, forwards the plot a little bit, changes emotions, gives you a better insight into how the characters are behaving. If that's the case, then that scene should be there. I don't tend to write sex scenes to titillate, though obviously, if I'm going to have a sex scene in my book and it's going to be explicit, I'm going to write it so that people enjoy reading it. But again, another major difference. That being said, as we can see on Book Talk, a lot of people seeing as many scenes as you get in fan fiction in traditionally published books, people are really excited about that too. So smut does sell. Um, I think it can be up to sort of like your mileage may vary. As we said last time, fan fiction often the good sex scenes written in fan fiction tend to be some of the best sex scenes you're going to be able to read because again, traditional publishing like avoids them. You still want to think about how much smut you want in your book and why you want it in your book and what purpose is it serving. Plenty of authors, Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros, are doing exceptionally well for themselves in the romantasy genre, in part because people like continuously reading the sex scenes that they include in their books. So understand that it is more taboo, that I think it has a great place in fandom, and I wish we actually saw more of the queer exploration of sexuality stories out in, traditionally published spaces. Um,
Starting to see a rise in that, especially with like heated rivalries taking off
uh,
so well,
that's
and
good.
especially
Agreed.
that you're starting to see like some of the more popular books that I've been seeing on Book Talk and Bookstagram are the sapphic romances, are the male romances. And so there is an audience for it, but it's not really being traditionally published. And again, this is what Kat was saying, it's still kind of seen as taboo because in many ways, depending on where you are in the world, like we're in the United States, we're still very much a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation that like will clutch your pearl if somebody says, let's have sex.
Yeah, and despite the fact that, again, the first thing the printing press probably printed was porn. So you have to make a decision for yourself, like what level of sex you want to put in your own writing, understanding that people flock to fan fiction to look for, their favorite characters having sex. It basically comes down to, what do you want your story to be? What do you want your story to focus on? And I think each of us gets to make our own choice about where we want to draw the line and what that line wants to be for us.
Like there's a very big audience out there for closed door romance, which are romance that are the fade to black. It's that
Ah,
you may
yeah.
see a couple of kisses, you may see them holding hands, but there's no explicit sexual conduct in the story at all. And there's a very big audience for that. There's also an extremely big audience for the open door.
Yeah, I've heard agents ask if like a book is clean, which means, is it closed door? Um so I think overall those are those are the things, at least for me, that I think about from my experience converting fan fiction into original fiction, um, that I would consider sort of the biggest bad habits I had to break. But think about this. You are a fan fiction writer. You love writing fan fiction. You have great stories, and you've been enjoying yourself thoroughly when you're doing it. Sometimes it's also worth thinking to yourself, is it worth the amount of time it's going to take for me to take the story that I am writing in fan fiction and convert it, given again, it's not easy. You have to rebuild a world, rebuild characters, look at your plot, find all of the places you've used your bad fanfic habits and get rid of them. Or is it worth taking a story that is already in your head, that's an original on its own, and writing that? And I think that answer is different for every story and every person. Some stories I've written, I know will never be outside of the fan fiction realm because I don't want them to be. I don't see them as being things that I have reasons that I'd want to convert. On the other hand, there are a couple stories that I have written that are alternative universe enough that I'm like, oh, I could make this steampunk. I could make this steampunk and it would be so good. And it makes me actually want to take that story out.
Then there's also sometimes, like if you could do like one of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm testing an idea for a story. So what do I mean by that? I'm writing it for the fandom, knowing that I'm going to rewrite it essentially when it goes for traditional publishing. But I just want to make sure that people enjoy the storyline that I'm creating because it's not one that I've typically written in the past. And I'm one of those people, and Kat will always like chastise me for it. I like the dopamine of I publish a chapter and I get the feedback on the chapter, and then that helps me figure out what I'm doing with the next chapter. I'm not somebody who likes to sit and hold books until they're published. And I was a nervous wreck with my latest book that went out because I sent it to my editor and then just like gave myself an ulcer while I waited for the feedback.
Well, and that's the other thing that is a truism of all this is you don't have to stop publishing fan fiction just because you're also writing originals. Um, Same goes for me when I realize that like my writing is feeling a little bit lonely. I'll often go back and I'll put a chapter out in one of my sort of ongoing fan fictions because it helps me keep motivated. As we said last time, it's bringing your Greek chorus and bringing your cheerleaders to you for a second to sort of give you that like little boost in motivation that you might need. So, I hope that in this episode, we've given you a lot of reasons to look at fan fiction differently and to look at your fan fiction differently and understand why, number one, you're writing in a way that could be an original story and could be traditionally published. And you just have to decide if you want to put the work in to make it into something that is that. So this is where so Rubia, what is our too long didn't read for this episode?
Our too long didn't read is there are some challenges if you're looking to transition a fan fiction work into an originally published novel because you're going to need to revisit your character's motivations and look to see if it really does make sense. But you're also wanting to make sure, is that scene absolutely necessary or is it just I want it there, but it doesn't really add anything to it. So if you're taking a story that you have in fan fiction, even if it's a super popular story and has like several thousand kudos, or just the likes, you need to go back and analyze it as if I'm not in this fandom and I'm rereading it, what draws people to this story?
And there you have it. So again, you have been listening to the Writing Affliction podcast with Kat and Katz. You can find me at my website, katherinethornwood.com.
And you can find me at my website, rkatzbooks.com, rkatzebooks.com.
Thanks again for listening.